Hello and welcome to this video on albinism. What it is, why it happens, and how it has the observed symptoms. Albinism is a heritable condition. This means that no melanin is produced. It leads to lack of colour or the white appearance of skin, hair, scales, feathers, or any other bodily feature, except eyes which appear red. This means albinism is a genetic condition with the pathogenesis and etiology in the observed effect. It affects about 1 in 20,000 people globally. The highest rates are seen in Panama and Colombia, where approximately 6.3 people in every 1,000 are albino. We know much about its epidemiology and about how it works and what we see. First, there are the genetics. While there are rare examples of mutation leading to albinism, these are exceptions. The rule is that it is a recessive condition inherited from the mother and father. This first point is important. As a recessive gene, someone may be a carrier and not know it. When they reproduce with another who has the same recessive albinism gene and is a carrier, their offspring have a chance of being an albino. There are two large groups of pigmentation molecules, and these are affected by the albinism genes. These are eumelanin and phenylanin. The former is responsible for darker skin and hair colours, while the latter is responsible for lighter colours like blonde and red. Between these two broad categories, there are 19 known associated genes, but there is also evidence of a large gap in the identified genetic causes and all cases of albinism. For the most part, we can look at albinism as falling into these are oculocutaneous albinism, or oculo meaning eye, and cutaneous meaning skin. So as you can imagine from the name, the hair, skin, and eyes are all affected. This is arguably the type of albinism most closely recognized as being the condition. There is a specific subset called ocular albinism, and this is relatively rare, involving only the eyes. In order for either of these to happen, the person who has albinism must have inherited 2 copies of the mutated genes, and these will come from both of the parents. They are autosomal, so this is not a sex-specific condition. There are a number of genes associated with the oculocutaneous albinism, and they are labeled OCA 1 to 7. This is the specific area required, but it's also theoretically possible that there are as yet unidentified genes that are involved in it that would likely receive a name to the effect of OCA 8 and so on. Because there are different genes and these can have different effects, the amount of pigmentation or lack thereof seen in a person with this kind of albinism will vary. Ocular albinism is somewhat unique, and that's because it is primarily limited to just the eyes, and this in turn leads to vision problems. Unlike oculocutaneous albinism, ocular albinism appears to have a close association to mutations in the X chromosome. This means you're much more likely to see it in males than you are females, as females have 2 copies of the X chromosome, therefore if one is defective, the other will take over. Males only have 1 copy. This is closely associated with various issues with vision, but one notable point to make is that albinos do not have red eyes because that's the colour of their eye. Rather, it is the lack of colour, and that we're seeing, effectively, the red blood cells in action and the colour they put off. There are a handful of diseases where albinism could be considered a side effect of sorts. This includes conditions like the Hermansky-Pudlak syndrome, and this leads to the same sort of effect as albinism itself, but is associated with a different condition. Beyond those effects already mentioned, albinism has a range of other effects. The notable and probably likely immediately obvious for many people who are in this situation is abnormal eye development and appearance. As we've mentioned, the colour of the eye is not from the albinism itself, but rather the lack of pigmentation. Because you don't have the normal development of the eyes, and particularly coloration of them, you can find that albino individuals have issues to do with depth perception and focusing. If individuals who are albino are exposed to intense light on a regular basis, they may also begin to lose their eyesight much more so than a regular person would. This is because the photoreceptors in their eyes begin to undergo apoptosis in response to it. Structurally, the eye has other issues as well, notably the underdevelopment of certain parts of the eye, primarily the rod cells, and because there aren't as many rod cells, approximately 25% below the normal amount, they have more issues to do with photoreception. That is the ability to see certain light wavelengths, especially at night where the rods have the biggest impact on vision. There's also issues to do with sunlight, specifically the lack of protection. Melanin exists, in at least most terms, to provide protection from ultraviolet radiation. This is why those who can trace their lineage back to areas with extremely high levels of sunlight tend to be much darker skinned than those who live in areas with less sunlight. Melanin has been selected for as a trait over time to protect them from this. If instead you have an individual with practically no melanin production, they will have practically no protection from UV light. This means that what would be a sunburn for any regular individual could be a lot worse with someone with albinism. An albino person cannot have treatment for their condition itself. There is no solution to it. However, there are quality of life features such as using vision aids, appropriate types of glasses, regular eyesight testing, use of sunscreen, and avoiding prolonged exposure to sunlight. Most often, they will need to use protective clothing, and generally much heavier protective clothing than a regular person would, to minimize the amount of possible sunlight that will get through, even when wearing it. The final feature is the use of extremely dark sunglasses. This is to block out as much UV light as possible to protect their already vulnerable eyes. The signs and symptoms of albinism can be very stark and obvious, too subtle depending on which genes are mutated and exactly what's happened. Albinism is an untreatable hereditary condition. Much of the effect can be managed through lifestyle changes, but it cannot be stopped and will pass on to the next generation. This is one area where it is possible that gene therapies might theoretically be able to bring an end to a not necessarily life-destroying, but certainly quality of life ruining condition. Thank you for watching this video. If you all found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.